Here we go. Okay, so it's Saturday, which means I have a sub-threshold session to do. So as previously mentioned in the last two videos, I've been doing the Norwegian Singles Approach. And so if you clicked on this video, maybe you're also doing that training system. Maybe you've never heard of it. Maybe you're curious, or maybe you're just sick of hearing about it. And that's understandable. I had the same response when I first saw the Let's Run thread. I thought, there's no way you're going to get any faster if you're never running race paces in training. And that was about 2 years ago. But since then I've found that the more threshold training I do, the better I get. And when I try and increase VO2 max, the worse I get. So this is a natural progression to me to arrive at this training system, a system that tries to maximize the amount of, it's called sub-threshold, but it's really just threshold training. It's at this point in the video that I proceed to bang on about the benefits of threshold training in a way that isn't particularly interesting or eloquently put, so I'll spare you that. And so, to keep things simple, I'm going to explain what this system is and demonstrate how I perform a sub-threshold session without using a lactate meter. And then maybe later on in the video, I'll give my opinion on why I think this style of training works so well. But first, that term sub-threshold. It can be quite confusing given that it's often been used in running to refer to an intensity close to LT1 or marathon pace for most recreational runners. But in this system, sub-threshold simply means an intensity just below the anaerobic threshold. Marius Bakken, the creator of the original Norwegian method, the double threshold version, recommended a kind of sweet spot of between 0.4 to 0.8 millimole below the anaerobic threshold. When he stuck to this intensity, he not only recovered better between training sessions, he was also able to perform far more volume within each session with far less fatigue. And so this is the intensity we're aiming for. Now, without a lactate meter, we have to approximate that intensity, but using a combination of heart rate, pace, and perceived effort, we can get fairly close. So what do we got today? Well, I've got 3 by 10 minutes at around 30k pace with a 90-second recovery. All right, so let's get things going. Let's go. So what is the Norwegian Singles Approach? Well, the simple version is it's a 7-day structure that follows this pattern. Monday, easy. Tuesday, sub-threshold. Wednesday, easy. Thursday, sub-threshold. Friday, easy. Saturday, sub-threshold. Sunday, easy but longer. Now, each sub-threshold session in the week is slightly different. One session involves short reps, either 3 minutes or 1k. The second session involves medium length reps, either 6 minutes or 2k. And the last session involves longer reps of 10 minutes or 3k. Now, each is run at a slightly different pace, but each adds up to be roughly the same metabolic stress. Because threshold or sub-threshold isn't a pace, it's a physiological state. The shorter the rep, the faster the pace we're able to run and vice versa. If done at the right intensity, the frequent rests in between intervals will prevent us from tipping over threshold. With the longer reps, the rests aren't as frequent. And so if we were to run at the same pace, our lactate levels would slowly inch up and likely go over well before the end of the rep. This would defeat the purpose of the workout, which is always to stay below threshold, because that's where we're going to reap the benefits of the system. By avoiding the byproduct dump that comes with training above threshold, we're able to do a far larger body of work with less fatigue. To be more specific in terms of paces, there's a website called Lactrace, which provides pace ranges for individuals based on a recent performance. If I put my race time from a week ago into the calculator, it provides these paces. You can see that the recommended pace range for this session in particular is between 3:27 a kilometre and 3:37 a kilometre. You see that I stay within this pace range in this workout. In my experience, the pace prescriptions are fairly spot on, and they neatly align with where I estimate my anaerobic threshold to be in terms of both heart rate and perceived effort. The other side of the coin in terms of the overall system are the easy runs. If the goal is to maximise the amount of threshold running you're doing in a week in singles, then everything else is in service to this. Easy running is foundational and should make up at least 70% of your overall training volume, but it needs to be easy. The recommendation is to stay below 70% max heart rate. For many, this will be a challenge, but if performance is your priority, then you'll be willing to take the slight ego hit in exchange for better race performances. So to return to how I personally use a combination of pace, heart rate and perceived effort to lock into the right sub-threshold intensity. On their own, each metric has its own drawbacks. Pace doesn't take into account the weather, terrain or how you're feeling on the day, and that's before we even consider the accuracy of your GPS. Heart rate does somewhat take into account how you're feeling, but it also fluctuates with fatigue or freshness, sometimes counterintuitively so, and it's dramatically affected by the weather. And perceived effort can be distorted by our own will or emotional state. As runners, we're masters at deluding ourselves. We can convince ourselves that a pace was relaxed or comfortable even when it's basically a race effort minus the sprint at the end. It's why you see people titling their runs on Strava easy when they've essentially run their half marathon pace. But putting that aside, if we use all three metrics, in a way, each metric can fill in the gaps of the others, and we can ultimately triangulate the right threshold intensity. So when I take off at the start, I'm using my perceived effort to estimate the right intensity. I might check the pace after a few hundred metres to make sure I'm in the right ballpark, and then I'll keep an eye on my heart rate once that's ramped up to make sure it's tracking as it should. Now, I've given myself an upper limit, call it an estimate of my anaerobic threshold heart rate of 163 BPM. I've arrived at this figure after years of collecting heart rate data in threshold sessions and races. Half marathon races have been particularly useful, but I know that it isn't 100% reliable. However, it's just something outside of my own brain that prevents me from deluding myself into thinking I'm in much better shape than I actually am. And so I've stuck with this 163 BPM upper limit. I avoid going over it at all costs. And so to illustrate how heart rate plays out in these sub-threshold sessions, I typically won't get within 8 BPM of that figure in the first rep. Today was a little different, and there could be a number of reasons for that, weather, a slight reduction in training load, etc, etc. But my heart rate was unusually steady throughout the entirety of the session. What I would usually see is a gradual cardiac drift across the session, where I work my way up to 154 BPM in the first rep, push up to 158 in the second, and then maybe peak at 162 in the third. I see a similar distribution in other workouts as well. So why does this system work? Well, I could try to explain the physiology of threshold running, but the mere mention of mitochondria, the Krebs cycle, or the lactate shuttle tends to have people's eyes glazing over. So let's just stick to the sheer numbers. If I were doing a more traditional training approach, let's say with a VO2 max workout each week and then maybe a tempo run as the other workout. Well, the VO2 max workout might be 30 minutes in length, but I've spent 10 of those minutes jogging or floating the recoveries. So I've really only done 20 minutes of quality. In terms of the tempo run, maybe it's 30 minutes. Therefore, I've done 50 minutes of quality for the week. While under the singles approach, I'm doing 3 30-minute sessions every week. And so over the course of say 6 weeks, that adds up to 9 hours of quality running, whereas under the more traditional approach, I'd only be getting 5 hours. That's 80% more quality running each and every week. The absolute intensity might be slightly reduced, but it's a trade-off that still works out to be greatly in my favour. Now you might say, well, I could just do the traditional approach and add in another session, and maybe you could, but I personally found it impossible to do that without constantly getting injured. And I'd even argue that the 2-workout traditional structure was harder on my body than 3 workouts has been under this approach. For years, I wasn't able to up my mileage without getting constant niggles and full-blown injuries when including VO2 max workouts. But that aside, under the traditional approach, individual workouts are going to look far more impressive, but that's not how fitness is built, at least in my experience. Nailing a 5K specific workout may give you a confidence boost, but to put it in the words of Jakob Ingebrigtsen, you're just pulling the carrot out of the ground. Real fitness gains are achieved through consistently high volumes of intensity and overall running volume over the course of weeks, months, and years. Now, I've probably rambled on far too long in this video, so let's get back to the workout. You're right. So 3:35 a kilometre average for the first one. I think my heart rate, it might have peaked at about 158 at one point, which is a little bit higher than I'd like for the first rep, but the effort felt right. It is a little bit warm out here today. Well, not really warm, but warmer than it has been. Might affect it a little bit, but it was pretty steady at around the 155, 156 towards the end, which is about right. 90 seconds recovery can feel a bit long sometimes, but I haven't adjusted it. Trying to stay consistent with the sessions every week. Here we go. My camera battery died roughly 2 minutes into the second rep, but I'll quickly take you through how the rest of the session played out. In the second rep, the pace quickened a little, down to 3:33 a kilometre, but my heart rate still only peaked at 158 BPM, the same as the first rep. The average heart rate for this rep was 154 BPM, and my perceived effort was the same. I tend to find that it's fairly common to be a little slower in the first rep, as my body hasn't fully warmed up. In the third rep, my pace split the middle and I averaged 3:34 a kilometre. So I was pretty consistent across the 3 reps. In terms of perceived effort, I think I nailed this session. The pace wasn't as quick as I'd like, but that doesn't really matter. Ultimately, getting the work done is what will lead to performance gains. You can't get too hung up on the paces of any one workout. For the most part, it's just box ticking. My heart rate peaked at 161 in the final rep, which means I still had a buffer to that figure of 163 BPM that I'm trying to stay below. My average heart rate in the final rep was 155 BPM. So there we have it, a sub-threshold session. If you like these nerdy training videos, be sure to subscribe. Next week I'm going to go through my plan for marathon training, heading into the Melbourne Marathon in just under 10 weeks. Until then, remember, you can never take your hobby jogging too seriously.